In this video, I'm going to show how to create a font class so that you can only load one font and use that same font for all of your text files throughout your entire sfml program. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a class, and I'm just going to call this class fonts. And we may want to have a few different fonts that we can use. So rather than just making this font class hold a bunch of fonts, I'm gonna have it so that you can just pass a enum to a static function in this font class, and it'll return a font according to the enum that was passed. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that I include the sfml library. All right, and then now I'm going to go ahead and set up my class. So I want to be able to have multiple fonts, right, for each different type of font that I have. So I'm going to create a private static member variable of type vector, and this is basically going to be a vector of SF fonts, which is the class that will load fonts into the memory. This is the sfml class that will load fonts into the memory. So I'll just call this fonts. I also like to keep a Boolean, I like to keep a vectors of Booleans just so I don't have to call the load font to file function multiple times. I like to just call it one time. I don't think it's necessary, to be honest. I don't think sfml really has a problem with it. It's just a preference of mine. Alright, so now we want to be able to create some functions to be able to so that the user could call. And so basically all we want is the user to be able to say get a font and just pass an enum to determine which font they want to get. So I'm going to go ahead and create an enum, and I'm going to call it fonts. I'm going to do lowercase fonts. It might not like that. I'm going to change the name of my vector so that we have two different names. All right, and so in this example, I'm just going to do a couple of fonts. So let's say that we have a Open Sans, bold, and then we also have Arial, and I think I also have a font inside of my example called Arcade. So we'll go ahead and do 3 just for the example. So now what we want to do is we should have a function that is that's gonna load the font into the file only if it hasn't been loaded yet. And then we're going to also need a function to be able to get the font. So since the user really only needs to get the font, I'm going to go ahead and make this particular function a static function, and I'm going to make it a public static function. And it needs to be static because my private variables are going to be static, which I failed to do, so we're going to go ahead and make those static. Right, and the reason why we're making it static is so that these variables only get created once when the program is first starts running, and then it never gets created again. So whenever we call a font, we're going to call the same font over and over again. So here we go. So if I'm going to actually pass this font that's loaded inside of this vector, I need to make sure that I return a reference to the font and not just a regular font, because if I do a regular font like this, it makes a copy of the font, and therefore it's not going to give me the actual font that was loaded into the memory, and that's where we get a lot of errors, right? That's the whole purpose why we want to actually make this static class, so that we can actually get the actual font that was loaded into the memory, and that font that was loaded into the memory will only be loaded once. So we're going to make this a reference, and we're going to call this one get font. And then here we're going to pass in a enum, right, to determine which font we actually want. So I'm going to say fonts, and then I'll just call it font. Right, so when I use it, I'm going to pass one of these enums to this function, and then it'll return the font that matches this this enum, which means that we need to create a function to be able to map the enum to an actual file path. So I'm going to make that private because the user doesn't really care about that. All they want to do is call this get font function. So I'm going to make a static and I'm going to return a file path. So I'm going to return a string, and I'm just going to call it map font. And inside of here, I'm going to also pass a font enum, which means that I need to actually move my enum up so that my private will actually, or I'll just move my private down so that my private actually recognizes the enum. All right, and so I also want to make a private function to load the font, and that's going to be a void. It doesn't really need to return anything. So I'm going to call this load font. And inside of here, again, I want to pass in which font I want to load. So that's going to be fonts. All right, and so now I'm just going to go ahead and implement these functions. So first thing I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and just generate these. I'm going to let CLine generate the definitions for these. And then I also have to make sure, since I have these two member variables, static member variables, I need to actually declare these inside of my CPP file. So I'm going to go ahead and do just that. When we declare, we don't need static. And then also we need to use our class scope resolution operator so the compiler knows that this underscore fonts is actually referred to the one that was declared inside of the H file. So we'll just go ahead and say fonts. All right, and so with my get font, I simply just want to return whatever font matches the enum. Right, and so I'm going to use the enum to be the index for my font vector. So basically I'm just going to say return underscore fonts at font. Right, and so that means that the font was Open Sans, that would be index 0. If it's Arial, that would be index 1. If it's Arcade, that would be index 2. So I'm using that to be my index for my get font. So that function is actually pretty much done. The next thing I need to do is just return the map. So basically, if I get the Open Sans as the enum, then it's going to return the path to the Open Sans font. If it's Arial, it'll return the path to the Arial, and same for Arcade. So let's go ahead and just create a switch. I think a switch is a really good way to do that. So I'm going to check and see what font it is. And then in the case that is Open Sans, then we will just return the path, which will be fonts, and then Open Sans bold .ttf. I might have to fix this path. Let me actually get those paths from a different project. I'm going to go ahead and grab the paths and actually put these paths inside of my program. So here I'm just going to go ahead and paste all my paths. And so Yeah, it looks like I typed the path wrong. It's Open Sans dashboard. So that is the path to my Open Sans. In the case that it's Arial, then I'm going to return the path to my Arial, which looks like it's fonts / Arial.ttf. And then in the case that it is arcade, then I'm going to return fonts, arcade.ttf. Alright, and so now we're good. Of course, if you were going to have more fonts, then you would just do cases for all of them so that you can translate your font, your enums to an actual font path. So that is actually done. That's all we need here. So now I'm going to implement my load font. And so basically what I want to do here is just I want to check if the font was loaded, then I don't want to do anything. Otherwise, I'm going to load it. So I'm going to check my loaded, right? This is my loaded vector. So I'm going to check it and see if it was loaded. So I'm going to go ahead and say if loaded at font. And let me just change this to font because I like font better. So if it was not loaded, then let me go ahead and load it. So I'm gonna then say fonts at index 0. Excuse me, fonts at index font dot load from file, and then I'm going to I'm gonna map the enum to its path. So I'm gonna call my map font, and then I'm gonna pass in that font. And so now I am loading the font into the memory. And then the last thing I want to do is, well, since it was loaded, then I need to go ahead and let my Boolean vector know that that font was loaded. So now I'm going to say loaded at index font is equal to true. And that way, the next time I try to call this function and tell it to load a font, if it was already loaded, it'll just skip this and it'll do nothing. All right, so now that I do that, then I can call this load font just before the get font, right? So when someone is trying to get the font, I'll go ahead and see if it was loaded first. If it was loaded, then I just return fonts, right? I just go to this line. If it wasn't loaded, then that means it's going to go and load it. So that's what the get font is going to do. All right, so last couple things that we need to do is we need to initialize these particular font variables because right now this is a vector, and that means that they don't have anything in them. And so if I do something like this, right, try to get an index, then it's going to actually crash because that index doesn't exist anymore. So what I like to do is a little trick. I like to go, and in my enum, I like to put one final case, right? And this is called last. And this last will always be the very last enum. So if I ever need to add more fonts, then I would make sure to add them before this last enum. And the reason why I do that is because this last enum will now hold the number of enums that are inside of the whole fonts enum, right? So for example, this would be 0, this would be 1, this would be 2, this would be 3, right? And that's 3 fonts that are in there. And so I can use that value to give my vector some defaults. So I'm going to go ahead and default my vector, right? And I'm going to say put in 3 vectors. Put in 3 fonts. Right, so now this gets defaulted with 3 fonts. And I can do the same thing for my booleans. I'll say go ahead and put in 3 false. Alright, and so now my class is actually set up. Of course, my program is not set up yet to recognize this as the correct path, and that's because I need to change my working directory. So I'm going to make sure I go to Run, Edit Configurations, and I'm going to change the working directory so that it is at my project. Alright, and now we're good to go. So now it's time to just go ahead and test it out and see if it works. So I'm going to go to my main, and I'm going to create a couple of textures. I'm sorry, text objects. So I'll call this hello, and then I'll do another one called world. So we have 2 text objects. I'm going to set the first one to hello and the second one to world. So we have hello dot set text. We'll set string to hello, and then I'll say world dot set string to world. Oops. Alright, and now I'm gonna give them the same font, right? I want them to both, I don't need to have 2 separate fonts for them. I want them both to be in the same font. So I'm gonna now include my fonts class that we just created. Alright, and now I'll call the set font function. So hello dot set font, and then here, since I made it a static class, I don't have to create an object to type fonts. I'm just going to call my get font function. And in this case, let's make it Arial. I have to use the class scope resolution operator, so fonts Arial. Alright, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing for hello world. So I'm just going to copy this and change this to world. Alright, and so now they're both going to be default to set at 0, 0. Of course, I want world to be next to hello, so I'm just going to go ahead and change the position of world. So I'm going to say world dot set position, and I'll put that at 0, 100, and just for testing purposes. So of course now we want to draw hello, and we want to draw world. Alright, and now when I do that, I'll run my program. And as we can see, we have hello and world, and I just now realized that I changed the y value, not the x value. But there we go. We see that we have 2 objects using the exact same font, and everything works fine. And then we no longer have to load a new font for every text object. We have 2 text objects that's using the exact same font. Alright, and that is it. Thank you for watching.